everyone. Welcome to round two of TAYDO. I'm reading the chat. It's Yugenesh. Without further ado, let's start with the listening. Yes. This is so sorry. Nice to see you. Yeah.
I think if you are 5 minutes onwards, but I'll allow one early for who to challenge frame. Okay. One very important thing I'll do in my speech. I'll just explain to you why this week is about feminist movements and why necessarily is about achieving some form of holistic impact with all women on the ground, equally for mothers as well. The important frame that we need to note in this debate is that it's uncontestable that motherhood is difficult and it's going to be equal or harder than a job. It's about raising a life. It's about bringing up a kid into the world and like explaining how to do certain things and etc. And while a large chunk of the time, it's extremely demanding. It requires you to put in the effort, it requires you to put in the emotional labor, the physical labor, the financial labor, etc. This is important because necessarily a large chunk of what happens within society, that society perceives motherhood as one that's glorious, it's about purely sacrifice, it's about martyrdom, it's about dying for your child, etc. And necessarily why this is bad. What will prove to you is that the delta is very clear. That when you shift towards perceiving it as a job, that there are multiple different things that come alongside this. One of them probably is how we perceive, just like a normal day-to-day job, right? How we set boundaries potentially about recompensation, etc. Therefore, that's why the first part on external impact is to talk about why you now allow for greater demand for recompensation. It's about talking about how women on the ground now are able to weaponize the narrative to challenge the idea that it's about sacrifice, it's about love, but see that I demand more than just this idea of sacrifice and love, and it's a one-sided job. The reality is the ability for you to, for example, demand compensation later is not purely about financial. So it may sound like, but you pay people in a job, and that's great. It's more than that. It's also the emotional compensation that you require from your spouses, from your family members, that now that because you're raising a child, etc., that probably you demand by virtue of you knowing this is good. I'll explain to you why this is important very simply. Because in status quo, the ability for women to challenge the narrative that's about sacrifice is extremely hard. There's a higher burden placed upon women to explain as to why they shouldn't be martyrs within this process, and why necessarily you demand more when you should just shut up and push forward because you're a mother. The idea here is simple, is that it's the mental calculuses of the women to push back against the system and just necessarily demand more. But secondly, that when the feminist movement is the one that advocates for this, it justifies this belief and justifies that women have a position to stem themselves and say these things that we want, these things that we actually need in order to become mothers. Sure.
What happens if
What? Sorry?
What happens to children of mothers?
Well, a job isn't necessarily always 9 to 5. There are a lot of different jobs. Obviously, this job entails a constant need for affirmation and attention. Therefore, it's seen as a bigger job than your 9 to 5s. By virtue of that, your children will also see that as, wow, my mom's working 24/7 for me. That's great. But the second layer to this is as simple as to explain it's not only about the child, it's also about the individuals around your child. The need for you to wake up at 4 a.m. and change their diapers or feed them milk is something that most jobs don't do. So if you actually do a comparison between multiple different jobs, you probably see the glorification of being a mother through this job. But necessarily, it's through this pragmatic lenses that society constantly goes through because of its utilitarian bias. And because of this weaponizing of this utilitarian bias, we're able to allow for this demand to change. But secondly, it's to then talk about why you allow mothers to feel catharsis. I think this is the more important argument because it's about necessarily how women feel themselves the moment in which they become mothers, and why the capacity you can access from this is far better the moment in which you are able to see a job. Let's necessarily look at how narratives around society works in status quo. A large chunk of the time, people ridicule mothers because they say, but that's not a real job. You're doing very limited. You're just like, changing diapers. You're at home most of the time. It's very comfortable at home. And that's what like breadwinners and like bad fathers constantly say, right? The reality is that, oh, I have to go to a 9 to 5, I'm struggling there, etc. But when we balance the equation, argue that this equivalent to a job, those types of narratives no longer are strong or have any potency. When you're able to challenge those ideas and say, but I'm doing a job as well. I'm also doing a 24/7, I'm also taking care of the child, I'm also doing multiple different things. And by virtue of that, this changes against that. But more importantly, it's not about men purely changing their perspective, etc. It's about women and internally how they can process this to change those things. The delta is simple. If women can finally access the idea that they're equally important within society, to challenge the idea that men are the most important because they're breadwinners, is when women are probably going to feel far better later. It's when necessarily when women are able to perceive things as themselves as the main character, as opposed to purely the idea that they're supplementary in the process of raising a child. But secondly, it's also about how necessarily in the idea of the ideation of a woman, it's about how you make your decisions prior to becoming a mother. That a job is extremely taxing, that a job requires a lot of commitment to this. It is only when you're able to shift this perspective from purely the constant overarching idea that you should sacrifice, that being a mother is great and all the good things out there, that you're able to make women make better decisions when it comes to rational decisions, like picking up or being a mother. That's point in time where we're able to push back against narratives like your like guys or like fathers trying to change things. I know it's exposed you.
If people or the actual mother is slapping the title of the job changes that happen.
I explained to you that it's about the utilitarian bias, that we see jobs as something that's proximate. And most people within society do have jobs, right? So the reality is that it's quite proximate. We respect jobs. We look at jobs as things that are fundamentally important in the bricks of society. And therefore, when women are part of this process, then they're relevant and equally relevant to this. Because oftentimes, motherhood is seen as completely outside the scope of a job. It's completely seen as, well, it's a moral obligation placed upon you and you need to do this. But the perspective of a job per se allows you to shift this moral obligation and say, but it's my conscientious decision to become a mother, my conscientious decision to raise a child, and therefore I should get a lot more rather than what society perceives I should get. It's not purely a moral obligation, but something I should be given. Therefore, it's very simple. The delta here is that we're proving that fundamentally the way society perceives you and you perceive yourself changes to be better.
That the feminist movement is inherently supporting a narrative that is patriarchal by its inception. Because of the fact that this narrative is already prevalent in society and is established by the patriarchy, and the feminist movement ought to support it, very powerful post. I'm going to treat this and set up before responses. The first is what the counter narrative that we're going to set up under our role. I think there's things like entering the job market and like entering motherhood are things that choices that the feminist movement empowers. So we're running basically we're going to empower choice feminism. If you want to opt into being a mother, but you want to opt into having a job, and it's things that we are going to inherently empower. Secondly, what's the most important metric and stakeholder you ought to prioritize in this debate, because it is these people who want to go against knowledge already set up in society. So right now, we perceive motherhood as the role for women to opt into because of patriarchy. So the debate has to be centered around people who don't have access towards jobs, because in fact, the women who want to be mothers are already empowered by the narrative set up by the patriarchy. What is the third thing on the burden then? I think what a girl has to do is that they have to explain why we're wanting motherhood to replace why we're wanting motherhood to replace some choice feminism with something that is inherently empowering towards the entirety of the feminist movement. I want to give two major responses. That the first thing on welfare is the pragmatic outcome coming from OG. I think there's already welfare in the status quo, so that means you don't need to have things like jobs to be able to obtain that welfare inherently. So this means that the entire mechanism and pragmatic outcome is suddenly washed out this debate. The second substandard they give you as to valuing and empowering women who opt into motherhood will be contested and integrated into the third argument. First argument, let's explain to you the role of feminist movement. Two things. The first is that the role of the feminist movement is to go against the patriarchy, so as to upend long-standing ideals about women inside of society to go against this in the first place. Secondly, why is this narrative inherently patriarchal and one principle the feminist movement should directly oppose it? It's because of the fact that the idea that women's role in society is inherent to becoming a mother is already established in the status quo. So this means that when an entirety of self empowers is going to be extremely bad. Because you don't get any sort of empowerment towards women who want to break out of that break out of that narrative inherently. That's what's the impact of this? Two things. The first is that you remain principally consistent with the feminist movement, but secondly, you also just empower the most disenfranchised movement. Because the feminist movement isn't just about empowering the choices of isn't just about going against the narrative that exists in the status quo. It's to countervail this narrative. It acts as a battling force against the narrative that exists in the status quo. This means that there are no other alternative actors that can go against this narrative because it's not prevalent. So as the feminist movement, as the largest social movement that empowers and protects and empowers women, you ought to go against this narrative that's already inherently patriarchal.
So in the COVID-19, emergency healthcare workers were able to gain rights by saying that their job was the most important. Why do you have separate glorification from the job?
The first thing is that if you're able to outline what legislation that being a mother is probably hard and extremely taxing, you can inherently get all the benefits of welfare that you want to get in the status quo. So you already see this happening in the status quo. But what we're going to uniquely call it to you is that calling a job is actually extremely bad towards the feminist women and women who want to opt into getting jobs. So this goes into the second argument on how it's far less likely for the side of God to get any sort of job and mechanisms to get that. What the benefits on the outside? Two things. The first is that the very least we're able to get safe spaces that empowers the dreams of women that want to get careers. Because every other content the narrative that God would call it to you would tell women that you don't have to get jobs because you're already a mother and that constitutes as a job. Secondly, what are advocacies to get jobs in the feminist movement far better on the outside? Because the most damn political thing and narrative used against women is that you already have a job because you are a mother, so they will not empower you getting careers. That is what for example, people who go against the feminist movement were apparently used to push against the feminist movement. So, one, you got under God saying you stagnant and you had the idea that you already have the benefits of a job because of the fact that you're already opting into motherhood. What's different on the outside for two reasons? The first is that when you tell people that motherhood isn't a job, you actually, in fact, have more advocacy and space towards women who want to get a job. So you tell society that women not having a job is missing in society. So if it's true of OG and having a job is so incredibly important towards the human experience, then you are able to empower legislative change, or you're at least able to empower the social narrative that women are able to get jobs in the first place instead of just opting into motherhood in the replacement of a job. I think the final way of this is simple. Even if you don't believe that you can get things like advocacy, you can get things like safe spaces towards women who actually want to opt into just in the first place, you're able to get that change for that. It's not only for directly responsible the second substantive coming from OG. You can explain to you and they concede to the idea that being a mother is actually harder than a job. So that's the entire thing that the argument is premised upon. The way you're going to contest it is disingenuous. You compare it to a job because it's actually harder than a job. Two things. Firstly, why is motherhood different from a job? Two layers to explain why. The first is that you cannot block out of motherhood. So, example, if you're opting into motherhood and you have a child, you cannot opt out not feeding your child. After a certain time frame, you cannot not just feed your child, not take care of it. The second thing is that when you opt into it, it's common, so you have to commit to being a mother all your life, become a responsible mother towards your child. all this means that it is inherently different from a job, because a job is something that you can opt out of, it's something that is like something that you opt out of, something that you can inherently stop, and something that you can quit. But inherently for motherhood, it is extremely hard to opt out of, and it is in fact permanent. The impacts towards this. The first is that actually you change societal perception of mother because you show that it is extremely taxing. So the comparison to a job will tell them that it is actually easy because you get other coping mechanisms towards a woman, like towards mothers. Because if they are able to tell that, oh, I have a job and I am able to cope with it because I am able to opt out of it, it's just far worse for the feminist woman or for the women who want to become mothers. In first place, we're able to empower women, like mothers who want to opt into it. So not only can we benefit the people who want to get jobs, we also benefit the people who want to become mothers. The second is that the benefit is that you actually get better mothers for two reasons. One, if people think that you sympathetically up into a job and it's going to be as easy, like you can opt into motherhood and it'll be as easy as opting into a job. For example, they can just clock out and they can quit the job anytime you want. They're more likely to opt into motherhood because there's this social perception that is the same as a job, that everyone can opt into it. But secondly, this also means that our impacting is important because you're able to get positive trend of like you're able to get better mothers because the fact people are going to evaluate the hardships of being a mother when you opt into it. So it's important because of the fact that you can see that mothers are probably having a harder job, like probably have a harder job as compared to something like a normal job, a normal 9 to 5. So this impact empowers women more. You can reflect the entire substandard toward OG. So you can actually claim all that benefits if you want to talk about empowering mothers and showing the hardship of being a mother in the status quo right now. You're the only side that empowers and remains principally consistent with the feminist movement for all those reasons involved.
Yeah.
I will see. I'm going to first deal with this idea of choice feminism, and I'll prove to you exactly why this doesn't work. Because how exactly are you making these choices in the first place? Because firstly, take a look at the capitalistic structures that already exist in society and the way in which they pushes women in order to just get jobs, or generally just pushes everyone to get jobs, because otherwise you're broke and you can't do anything that you want in your life. But also, you have contrasting and different narratives that also pushes based on where you live. For example, in Northeast Asia, where they tell you to go and get a job. And in fact, then you tell them not to get boyfriends, you tell them not to get married, and you tell them to get jobs because that's the best way in order for you to either A, be successful, or B, just make it in the world. That's why choice isn't something that's enough. Because any form of choices that you make under opposition's world is one that's skewed to the things that you are already exposed to, the forms of media that you are exposed to, the types of communities that you are already in, the way in which society around you tells you as to whether you should be a mother or you should just focus on getting a job in the first place. Which is why if the sole alternative and the counterfactual that opposition wants to argue is just let's have choice, we'll just say choose the job. But more importantly is that there isn't any form of exclusivity that all proves in their speech. There is no reason as to why this narrative cannot exist, simultaneously also giving women the choice to be able to choose as to whether they want to be a mother or want to just get a job in the first place. If anything, it makes things easier. You're choosing a job regardless, choose which job you want. So if choice feminism is true, it's a lot easier under Dowell, which means that you get more empowerment regardless of what choice that you would choose to have. So if you want to be a mother, and that is the job that you choose to do, that is something that you are getting compensation in return for all the sacrifices that you are making in order to be a mother in the first place. But regardless, yes, the feminist movement, this is something that's still non-exclusionary, because even if you don't opt into the idea of wanting to be a mother, this debate doesn't revolve around them, because these are individuals that aren't going to be negatively impacted by the forms of narrative that is going to be created. The reason for that is because even if feminist movement says that motherhood is going to be seen as a job, and motherhood is something that's incredibly taxing, is something that requires a lot of sacrifice and it deserves some form of compensation in return, you can choose not to opt into that, because choice feminism is still something that can exist under both worlds. It does exist in the way in which that you want to choose as to whether you want to be a mother or want a job in the first place. The second piece of response is the idea like, oh, there's already welfare. But the debate is about scale. You get more welfare, but there's a better ability for you to negotiate and talk about the fact of what your struggles currently are. The ability for you to explicitly say as to why this is something that's incredibly taxing, which is why it's going to be viewed as a job in the first place, which makes things easier for you to demand compensation from husbands, demand compensation from support structures that are surrounding you, because they recognize your sacrifices and they recognize that the pain that you have to go through in order to just be able to be a mother and raise your kid in a better way. But lastly, then, on these ideas of safe spaces, the ideas of, oh, you already have a job in terms of being mother, therefore you don't need to empower them. But like, what even is this argument? Because you can still be a mother, you can still choose to have that job. But even if you want to go completely extreme towards that, these are all individuals who agree with the pains and sacrifices that comes with being a mother, which means that they understand the struggles that all other mothers go through. Obviously, it's not completely 100%, everyone's going to be different, but the general scope of the debate is the fact that these are struggles that you can relate to, these are struggles that you can fight against, and these are things that you can demand compensation from. Because if you have a better ability to just garner the fact that these are all sacrifices that you're making in order to be a mother, and therefore make that a better ability for you to just fight back and get the compensation that you actually deserve. Lastly, then, on this idea of you create better mothers under their will, I don't think this is really true. If you wanted to be a mother, you recognize the sacrifices that you are making. This is something that you can make because it's your own body and your own future that you need to think about. The thing that changes in the debate is the way in which the narrative works, which is how society views and your choices and how society views your job, whether that is just being a mother or being able to have more grounding in the capitalistic world or just getting more money because of it. Argument then, number one, why is this something that's in line with the fights of the feminist movement? I think I'm just going to skip over the first analysis to why the feminist movement is going to fight for women in general. It's something that already OO and OG already talked about regardless. But second is that why is it explicitly non-exclusionary? So even if women don't want to be mothers, number one, this is fair. Like, it's not going to impact you largely. But also, this narrative acts as a countervailing force to all the historical stigma that women need to get married, that they need to have kids before their biological clock hits, for example. These are all things that make things a lot easier because you give more validation for all the sacrifices that women have to make, because this is something that they don't have like the greatest amount of capacity to make those choices because of the way in which stigma and all other influences their decisions in general. But two is that if they do want to be mothers, why does this make things far easier? And this is the same as a counter's mechanism that doesn't get a response to, by the way, because when jobs are going to be viewed in a more utilitarian perspective, for example, it gives you so much more ammunition and power to be able to get the compensation that you actually deserve. You can put your balls on the table and you can fight against the patriarchal structures a lot better because these are jobs that are going to be seen. So all your bigoted men who feel like, oh, being a mother is damn easy and you can just do all this while also having a job, don't have the ability to use that as ammunition anymore, because it makes it seem that not makes it seem, it is going to be something that women have to go through, and the fact that they are already going to be struggling through that, they deserve the compensation for it. But number two is that it makes things easier for you to be able to set boundaries to what you want to do in your relationship, clarifying responsibilities that occurs between mothers and fathers in the world. It imposes the fact onto what your family structures are going to look like and what responsibilities that you hold into like your family. Before I continue, any of you guys?
Why is a strong mother is limited to a biological clock?
A, you're not limited to biological clock. You're limited to biological clock in either world. What happens under opposition's world is you're choosing between a job of being a mother or a job of being employed by something else. But what's also important is that people can just have two jobs, like if they really want to do it. And the benefit that we can get explicitly under OG is that there is more validation for all the sacrifices that you're already going through in the terms of your job of being a mother in the first place. And explicitly as to why that personal validation is something that's extremely important. The illustration as to why motherhood is going to be something that's extremely difficult is already talked about enough, and the recognition for it is going to be something that's extremely low to begin with, which is why the narrative is something is necessary. Because besides the fact that it's just going to act as a countervailing force, it's also difficult for each individual mother to reach that form of validation. The narrative coming from the feminist movement, people who also share about your struggles, people who can relate to you, makes it a lot more impactful to like each woman when these are women that are fighting for the same narrative that you want to. It pushes the need for compensation far greater than whatever you could have gotten on the side of opposition's work, because all it is seen as it is a choice that you chose to make, which means that you try to demand for things like compensation, it makes things a lot harder, because then the fault is on you for having a kid, and the fault is on you for all the sacrifices that you have had to endure, because that is a choice that you chose to make. This kind of shifts the narratives more in terms of the fact that these are all struggles that you have to go through, and the fact that our society already imposes that stigma and that forms of narrative that you need to do this. It makes things a lot easier for you to either A, opt out, or B, able to have more of the compensation in the first place. People don't just want to be treated well, but it's just also be treated fairly based on what exactly you deserve. It improves the way in which you have discussions in marriages and relationships. It clarifies responsibility a lot better. There become clear rules and regulations that care about, just like any other job. You can limit the forms of abuse and exploitation just like any other job that you want to. That forms of compensation is what that is needed from women on the ground, and that's something that can only be achieved in OG.
Yeah. So would you like to
So do you know what
Without hearing what it's saying. When the people.
So much as we want.
Oh, good. All right. I think what we want to note from opening opposition is that the overall number of mothers is not static. So if you can make the argument that more people will be coerced into becoming mothers in opening opposition, it does not matter how well your compensations are in opening government, because ultimately it is still a sacrifice that the mothers have to make. I.e., there's a cap to how well you can compensate mothers that ultimately compares with the sacrifice that they're making. If we prove that even in opening government's best case, you're never able to fully compensate mothers for the work that they do, then they are coercing individuals into becoming mothers who are not ready to become mothers, who don't want to become mothers, who deserve to have a career. I think a few things to say in this speech. Firstly, on whether or not they're able to actually treat mothers better. I think we would note that the demand for recompensation will never be able to fully cover all the overtime hazard pay that becoming a mother actually involves, like nursing at 3 a.m., the irreversible changes that pregnancy puts you through. No amount of money is going to be able to compensate for that. I.e., opening government waxing poetry about the sacrifices that mothers have to put through is not changing the fact that it is a sacrifice that women are expected to make, and only women are able to make. I.e., if everybody is expected to take a job in order to contribute to society, why is it not symmetrically true that people will now push a narrative on government that in order for women to contribute meaningfully to society, they must take up jobs, they must become mothers, given that they are ultimately the only people in the world who can be taking up those jobs, right? They'll be forced to take those jobs just because it is what is expected of them. What is uniquely different here is that this job uniquely requires a level of sacrifice that's uncomparable to any other job that opposition wants to talk about. Just talking about the physical bodily changes, giving up your identity to become a mother. In order to be a good mother, it requires the entirety of your identity, soul, and emotional capacity, none of which can be fully compensated for by a job under opening government. But unlike the COVID-19 healthcare workers that CG wants to talk about, not becoming a mother is not a decision that will kill anybody, which means that we don't want to be pushing people to become mothers because it is non-essential. I.e., if they do not want to be mothers, they want to have careers, we should allow them to do it instead of giving them incentives to become a mother. We only provide positive incentives when we want to encourage this behavior. When the patriarchy is already encouraging that behavior, we don't think the feminist movement needs to do any more of that. I.e., giving someone $1 million is never going to be able to compensate for the 50 years that they're going to have to devote to this job. Till the day they die, they will never get a moment of rest. I.e., calling it a job suggests that at some point there's a way to match the sacrifice through either economic or political compensation by the state, and we think that's just not true. This causes two harms. One, this is just misinformation. For all women who want to become mothers or who are on the fence or who believe that this is something they have to do, they now think, okay, the state is going to pay me X amount of money and I'm going to get this amount of rest days, I can become a mother because that's just like becoming a job. But that's empirically untrue, right? Your kid is sick, you can't do anything, you can't go hang out, you can't have an identity, you can't have friends. The point is that being a mother requires that sacrifice. But second of all, I think it is true that opening government case stands and you get bad mothers. And I think you don't think that's true, but being a mother is a sacrifice you must fully anticipate and take. And if they don't have that information, because the feminist movement is spreading that misinformation, then we're unable to have good mothers. I think we need to know this debate is not about do we have more mothers or are motherhood good or bad. It's about the role of the feminist movement, and it is not the role of the feminist movement to encourage women to make a difficult sacrifice that only they alone can make. But third, I think I want to challenge the idea that equating this to jobs is even the tipping point in maternal welfare, right? Like society doesn't actually revere jobs as much as opening government says. In a society that wants to shame mothers for being useless or lazy, that we do it anyway, the same way we shame like people who work at like low-wage jobs or like low-paying jobs, or the same way that people are advocating for work-life balance and quiet quitting and all that stuff. People don't actually care about jobs all that much. In which case, we think it's actually far easier on opposition to advocate this as a heroic act or a heroic sacrifice that like women are making for our society, for instance, and that we should empower that sacrifice however way we can, i.e. through supporting the family, through free K-12. We already have welfare for new mothers. That is not the tipping point in equating it to job. Like people are starting to value jobs less and less, and if a society wants to shame mothers for not doing their work, they're going to do it anyway. So we are going to have empower mothers best we can. Closing.
So what is that thing saying that respect for those? When is it?
So we respect that sacrifice, i.e. we're going to create mechanisms to allow mothers to be the best mothers that they can, i.e. giving people healthcare, giving people like free K-12, whatever. All these things already exist in the status quo and are a result of framing motherhood as an act and a choice that takes up your entire existence and life, which does not happen on government, i.e. it's not as in if you have a job, the government is going to compensate you greatly, because we still believe a lot of work has to be put into it. All this is to say is that opening government can suggest a convoluted equivalence for motherhood and jobs, but ultimately not the way that society is going to respond to it, i.e. they cannot control the way people will respond to that narrative, and in a society that already does not want to respect mothers as opening government talks about, their narrative is not going to make a huge difference. What we push is that motherhood is a job that is respected, is a task that is given some degree of respect, and that respect can only continue if we don't equate it to the jobs that people are slowly starting to lose respect for, i.e. jobs you are allowed to pop out of, you're not allowed to pop out of motherhood. I think that is a false equivalence that doesn't win opening government's women's any points. But I think we want to specifically talk about the women who do want jobs as well. I think it inherently has to be a trade-off, because this debate is not about existing in a vacuum, it is about the role of the feminist movement. I don't know what male glass ceiling that glass tower that OG is living in, but there's not a single society that encourages women not to get boyfriends and not to get married. If their characterization is that there already is a society that forces women to go into careers and never become mothers, I think that's a false premise for their argument to stand on. I mean, a liberal society may allow women the ambition of having careers, but it will never allow them to trade it up at the cost of becoming a mother. The responsibility will always be at the back of their mind. The expectation is maybe you go into having a career, but by the time you're 40, you should retire, have kids, something like that. What this changes is that on opening opposition, we are able to combat the overarching narrative that still needs to be combated. Opening government's policies, in fact, feed directly into the system by saying that women have the biological clock, like it's a specific job that only women can do. And if it is true that jobs are so meaningful, then women will be funneled into that specific job, and more women will have to be taking it up there. But I think what is important is that we value the more vulnerable actors in this debate, i.e. the people who want to have jobs, who don't want to be mothers, or people who are not suited to become mothers. The feminist movement's job is to protect people who cannot otherwise do so themselves. If it is true that the state is already providing welfare to new mothers, new families, as they do protect family units, then the feminist movement's job is to provide protection for those who cannot have it, those shamed for not having children, those who want to make the decision, who are on the fence. The feminist movement should not be providing the positive incentive for women to opt into a job for which not enough positive incentive can ever exist in order to fully compensate for the sacrifices that such a job requires.
Two contributions. First, why the feminist movement advocates for this very effectively. And second, absent the job, what else will be there instead and why it's worse. First contribution, why would this advocacy be done particularly well? The missing link in opening government depends on people buying in, which only we are able to mechanize through these reasons. First, jobs have varying tiers of importance. So as I flagged, medical workers in the pandemic also had jobs, but were highly glorified for the reason that even if there were obligations to care about society at large, to not abandon your duty as a healthcare worker, it was glorified because in spite of all those things, we still chose to be someone who's working the job, even if compensation was low, even if it meant that the compensation wasn't proportional to the type of work you're putting in. The fact that you were able to sign on your rights and responsibilities to an institution was something that was highly respected. Second, this is politically popular with both sides of the political spectrum. Liberals buy into this because it aligns with policies like more state spending, more redistributive economic policies to ensure everyone is able to get some form of money from the types of things they're doing. Conservatives also buy it because they want to combine the family unit with formal institutions. Look at Charlie Kirk, who is anti-tertiary institutions overall, but supports bringing back university courses who teach people how to become mothers, how to become good housewives. So conservatives have shown a preference for bypassing their initial pick against other forms of state intervention in cases where it aligns with protecting the family unit and formalizing the type of obligations we have on that front. But thirdly, this aligns with the feminist movement strategy of showing that women are capable. The problem right now is there's a patriarchal binary of choosing between motherhood or career. But what we are showing now is that women can become successful consultants, can become successful doctors, because if you have the skills for motherhood, you can also have the skills for other things. These are things which are valued. That the fact that you are able to have patience, the fact you're able to be good with numbers and planning is a skill that women generally have. And if we view that as something inherent to women's biology and whatnot, because of cultural norms, that shows that women can succeed in the workplace. This flips opening opposition, because the other thing is that they want to show women are capable in the workplace is by saying that motherhood is a job, means you are qualified for other jobs that also exist. This also says still that this doesn't encapsulate the true sacrifice, because maybe 500 ringgit doesn't actually encapsulate how much you're putting in, but the comparative is 0 ringgit, so surely something is better than nothing on that front. It's not clear why this is a normative debate about whether it's a job versus a sacrifice. My point is that saying that it's a job is more politically persuasive and gets more rights for these women. The second contribution then is what the narrative that motherhood is a job. How do we predominantly view motherhood in the counterfactual? Our claim is that it's viewed as a duty that is imposed onto women by virtue of who they are, rather than it being a choice they can choose. Opening half implicitly agrees to this, but I want to mechanize the reasons for why this is true. The first is because there are strong cultural norms that say that women should become mothers. So in Asian societies, the fact that it's seen as your duty to provide the next of kid, because that's how the generational wealth is transferred. That's how you protect the family name. That is the biological extension of all of the values that your family has had thus far, which is why at Chinese New Year, you're shamed for not really providing a child and so on. Secondly, there's strong religious norms. Religious texts have been inscribed in the theology that the duty of a wife is to be subservient to their husband, to raise a child that is in line with the values of Islam. And therefore, this is the most important thing you can do, because not only is it morally neutral, it's morally valuable for you to have the children in context of a religious norm. But thirdly, there's strong social norms that show, because kids subconsciously buy into the idea that it's a biological responsibility of women to have these children. So absent you saying it's a job, it's more likely to be seen as a duty. What is the implication of this characterization? Opening opposition says we want women to choose whether they want to become a mother or a duty, whether mother or not. The problem is that right now there is no choice, because a duty isn't something you can choose. It happens to you. It is imposed onto you, and that is the issue. With it being a job, sure, you can say that is your job. I can say no, it's not my job. But you can't say, no, it's not my duty, because the duty is far more inherent to your identity as a person, to your biology as a person. The second implication of this is that opening government draws a single line of you being tied to a biological clock in DPM, but they don't explain the implication of that. My explanation here is that this groups, while on their side, things will be far worse. You can't actually say that we are having more sacrifice, and by saying women sacrifice, we get more protections for women. They don't view that as something morally valuable, because it just happens to you, that you have to do it. Why are you being rewarded for something you have to do? And that's why opening opposition cannot claim welfare, cannot claim protections. The second part of this extension is what are specific elements of jobs that separate it from duties and why they are good. Why is this extension important? Opening opposition says we get welfare. What welfare? There's no illustration provided. What is the specific thing we're giving them? Cash handouts? Like motherhood protections? Not sure. The thing we're going to provide is two very explicit links for what separates jobs from duties, which explains why this narrative is morally necessary. First, jobs are something that you can opt out of, and we agree with opening opposition here, as opposed to where duties are inherent to you. Why is this important? The first is because many people already know they don't want to become mothers, because they know, they've seen in media how this has had a toll on their health, when you have postpartum depression, when you have to go through having working their career, also having a child at the same time. Now, the flip that opening opposition says is that it's bad for children if mothers opt out. But this ignores the point. Not all mothers opt out after already becoming a mother. Many choose to opt out when the duty is imposed onto them before they've actually given birth to the child. So on our side, the fact that you can opt out before even having a child is good. But second, let's assume their case that many people just falsely go into it and then cannot opt out. My claim is that because it's not a duty, there's nothing that says you specifically must do it. When it's a job, guess what? Other people can do a job. Fathers are more likely to be respected in value because they can take up the job. Social workers are more likely to be respected in value. They can take up the job because there's nothing inherent about a biological mother and a child, and that link is only the thing that gives these relationships value. Yeah.
You also say that various jobs have different level of respect. No one respects motherhood as a job for women on the side.
But your side is saying there are so many elements in society that respect the sacrifice of motherhood. I don't know why that goes away. Genuinely, overwhelming proposition never proves the link. For why shifting to a narrative of motherhood being a job means we suddenly ignore all the sacrifices that women make, we ignore all the hours they put in. It's completely the opposite. It aligns with proving it is a highly respected and valued job. So on our side, maybe some people opt out, but guess what? Other people can take the job. It's good for fathers to have paternity leave. It's good for the father to have more investment in the emotional well-being of the child rather than just the mother being seen as the caring one and the father being the cold one who just pays for everything. Second thing, jobs are something you have to be qualified for. The problem is that not all mothers are the same. Some people should not be mothers, period. Number one, many of them are not in a good socio-economic position to do so. Number two, many of them have poor parenting skills because they have carrying on cycles of generational trauma. On our side, when you say being a motherhood means you have to be qualified for it, this means that people who want to become mothers learn more about it. They attend state programs that show how to be a good mother. And those who know they're not qualified, opt out because the initial opt-out mechanism I gave you. So all the people who become mothers are better mothers and kids are raised better. That is a massive impact in this debate. So we've explained what the characterization of the advocacy looks like, why it will receive buy-in, and why it turns out to be good. Follow Susan to the post. Bye.
So far in this debate, we hear motherhood as a gendered term, but the question that's never asked is, should it be? And I think the answer that CO provides here is no. The only way we get meaningful participation in the workforce is when women are actively taught to no longer be locked inside their traditional gender roles of what it typically means to be a mother. And in disengaging with what a gendered stereotype of parental duties necessarily is the point in which most women get larger degrees of freedom and financial autonomy. And that's the stance that feminism should take. What is the characterization that is agreed upon all houses? Is that motherhood is an inherent biological gender term. It is that only women can be mothers and only women can perform these actually agendered duties, right? Like as Umar and I assume opening government points out in their speeches, all these things such as raising a child, nurturing a child, are things that can be performed by fathers. But the reason that it is primarily pushed upon mothers to do so is because of the fact that society has entrapped them within the structure that tells them this is their primary duty in which they can enforce what they uphold familial structures. And at that point in time, if you continuously uphold the label of motherhood is when parents is when these jobs exclusively fall onto the shoulders of women, and that's the point in which largest degrees of harm manifest. Let's stop and co-opt most of what Umar's case necessarily is, right? The first thing on state spending and familial structures, I think we can co-opt larger forms of this, and as long as the feminism movement manages to successfully de-gender the terms behind parenting, right? Which means that if you transfer motherhood into just parenthood in general and imply a larger degree of social label as to what necessarily these categorizations of motherhood as a task is going to be, it means that more men are going to be involved in these tasks. And the point in which more men are going to be involved in these tasks, it means we capture most of the degrees of what Umar was described as larger degrees of societal support in order to create the structures that support these tasks, right? It means that if more men are involved in raising a child, if more men are expected to have larger degrees of hours in raising a child, that's the point in which we get larger degrees of better forms of childcare and paternity care. All of these impacts are symmetrical. But the second thing is that I think it's probably untrue on what Umar says is that you recognize motherhood as a skill. These skills are seen as transferable because no sane HR would hire a woman with no corporate experience because she's good with numbers and organized and gives you a family as a reference and recommendations. The third thing that he wants to talk about is the difference between duty and a job. This is semantics. When you sign a contract onto a job, you have a contractual duty to uphold your job. So as long as you sign onto a job, you create a duty for yourself, right? And I don't see an opt-out mechanism unless you kill your child, which is a criminal duty that you are not supposed to do. So I think that all this debate and conjecture about what is duty and what's job is effectively moot because at the end of the day, there is no realistic opt-out mechanism for what it means to be a mother, provided that you are always going to be the only mother in a relationship. Because guess what? If you're having biological children, it's one mama and one papa, and all of these jobs will push to the mama unless you can reframe these jobs in a agender way that is the case of CO. Why is it that we're capable of doing so? I think the first thing that is a step in rejecting motherhood as a label, in rejecting the label of motherhood as a job, is to explain that motherhood does not exist. We reject the idea that motherhood is a structure that is valid to uphold against women. Why is that particularly so? Because like the lie that patriarchy sells you is that the reason that this is a job is because you cannot have any other forms of employment. This is your only way in which you are capable of exercising autonomy and agency within this limited scope. This is all you have. And in fact, it actually encourages deeply toxic patriarchal narratives, right? Because if you are if this is your job, who is your employer? Who pays your bills? Who is the person you are feel largest degrees of debt to? It is the father. It is the individual who society has stereotyped to be the breadwinner, and individuals who actually bring in the money. And this is the person who holds the largest degree of financial and pecuniary interest towards you, which means that when you characterize motherhood as a job, what you actually characterize is a hierarchical dominance where men always exert larger degrees of power against women. And that's the point in which there's a point and frame in which the feminist movement has to promote going through, right? And it might be implied, and maybe it doesn't extend to the largest degree of toxicity, and maybe you can use it as leverage to get some rights for women. The point in time in which motherhood is seen as a job, it also means that fathers are less likely to participate in the details of this job, because they will see that, okay, I am paying you for a service. I'm paying you to raise my children. I'm paying you to buy my groceries. I'm paying you to cook those groceries and serve them to our beautiful children. And you should do that job. And why should I be involved in all of this? In fact, this clearly separate and categorizes the two types of roles in the household. There are male roles who are fatherhood roles, and there are motherhood roles. Fatherhood roles and motherhood roles never intersect. I'll take a point from opening.
So if you have a job, there's still work that needs to be done for that job.
Yeah.
If it means that you can demand compensation through financial means, or if it means that you come back from the office one day and you ask your husband to cut the onions because that's something that makes it easier for you, any form of compensation is a benefit on the outside.
But here's the thing, right? Like in your world, if motherhood is all of these domestic chores, that naturally means that the father will not help you with this because you see that part of your job scope. In fact, all of your other jobs that you choose to pursue on your free time is your own separate, like individual contractual duty workers that's not part of your main social contract with your father, right? But also, it's that like the point in which individuals delegate these jobs this way is the worst form, right? Because it genders the job. The expectation is when you enter into a marriage, when you have the child, you are automatically assigned mother or father. But I think that this is terrible because it actually opens women up to less ability to find the types of jobs like outside of the family that Tanish wants to describe, right? Because they will see that, oh, my primary form of employment and sustenance is my husband. It's this employer that is going to be feeding me, and that is the primary pecuniary financial role that I play in this household. And at that point in which we tell women these kinds of narratives, that's when they are less likely to go and seek independent financial autonomy because of the fact that they find themselves fulfilled and emotionally and spiritually and possibly even financially fulfilled by the limited roles that they have, right? I think that it is important that feminism incites women to explore more than what society tells them to, right? Because the point in which we tell women, this job, be happy and be content with this existing restrictive role that offers you the least degree of autonomy and the least degree of ability to seek upward mobility in the world. It's the point in which we kill women's dreams. We tell them it doesn't, what the rest of patriarchy says is correct. You need to fulfill your social contract to your husband before you fulfill any financial contract to your company. You do not recognize, in fact, the idea that women need larger degrees of upward momentum and financial stability and mobility. I think this harms the feminist movement the most, because the point in which women get larger degrees of financial autonomy is when they get political autonomy. They get to lobby corporations, they get to lobby politicians, they get to form support groups and all these other financial things that they are otherwise restricted from or have little degrees of meaningful access to. The point in which all of their finances and ability to access these the narrative society do not in fact support them individually exploiting this. The last thing we'll talk about here is just basic stuff like education and development, right? You're not going to develop a woman into being an independent woman if you see her job as providing for the children. And that's a very basic thing, right? What Umar describes here in what Charlie Kirk wants to do with the primary form of education in which feminists want to teach, in which feminists and in which like white society believes to be the role of woman. I think that's inherently harmful because guess what? Ain't no one going to hire you for being a mom. It's Galson. Can I have 30 seconds? Sitting down, we have to. I'm audible at this volume. It's fine. I got eyesight problem. Starting my speech in 3, 2. I just first knock out CO on this debate. CO tells us 3 things. The first is CO says that there is no opt-out to motherhood, even if it's viewed as a job. We would suggest that opt-out happens before having a child. People don't have to sign into the job if they don't want to. If opt-out happens after having a child, opt-out is just quite delusional because mothers are not just suddenly going to abandon their child. Those who opt out are unsustainable mothers, they'll opt out under both sides causes. The difference is other people can take up this job if the current employee fails, i.e., the father, for example, the caretakers that we suggest on Umar's speech, but other people cannot infringe on a duty. The second thing is, CO explains why there's no relative way to replace the mother. I find out that you're not replacing the gender of which mother based on two because mothers cannot change the gender that they're based on, but rather you are changing the way that they are the way in which they are viewed in society. You are changing how mothers are mothers are viewed as a primary role of what mothers of what women should do in their whole entire life. So you can whenever mothers want to pursue something in their free time or pursue other jobs while being a mother, you can replace it with people who can help them. People like fathers, for example. What does CO have to respond to this? CO claims that the father is the breadwinner, so they ultimately cannot escape the form of being a mother. Yeah, I don't think this is comparative. The father is the breadwinner under both sex houses. You'll still force people, you'll still force the women into being mothers regardless. The third piece of engagement with CO is that just positive. They don't really engage with the counterfactual that Umar pushes them about dealing with duty as a whole. And this also engages with Umar. The counterfactual that both opposition teams to defend is not necessarily advocating it for being not a job, but instead they have to defend another an alternative narrative. The intuitive mechanism under this is that the feminism movement want to solve this problem under both sex causes insofar as motherhood has a huge amount of people, the movement has a huge people of mother subscribers. This is where CG comes in and claims that they have to defend it being seen as a duty. We claim that there's a huge cultural and religious significance where women are going to be obligated as duties. This is where you see ancient Chinese culture where girls are born to get married off and reproduce. This is where you see the doctrines in Christianity that explicitly outlines the importance of women being a mother as a whole in society. So even if they do have the choice, that Owen talks about, they don't really have the choice insofar as this is the duties they are enforced on them onto the faith. Why would this extension be important in Spain? Twofold. The first step on likelihood of you opting out, there's a much higher likelihood for you to opt out of CG because duties are seen as an existential role that you have to the day that you die. Your mother will still be your mother, then you will call mother to the day she dies. But second, on jobs and pursuing different careers, that you have the flexibility because you cannot change the identity of duties. As long as the doctrines in Christianity or in Islam says that it is the fate of women, then you cannot justify this whatever the movement says. The second reason why this is important is talking about the flexibility to have someone to replace mothers in the event when the mothers want to pursue something or just don't opt in their mothers as a whole. I think this is important because it directly solves the problem of OO. Because if mothers already have children, what happens to mothers who cannot opt out? We explain why fathers can replace this in these circumstances. So this is directly engaging with OO's premise. The third thing that CO disregards, disregards is on the discussion of how jobs requiring qualification. When we know that motherhood is requiring skills, we get better as mothers as a whole because we want to develop these skills. I want to further engage with this later on my view with OO. Let's then deal with OG. OG tells two ways that we differentiate with OG. The first from training levels that we claim they don't explain why the feminist movement will do it in a good way. We claim to you two things. That first, this creates both buy-in from different points of the political spectrum, whether or not it's liberals or conservative or moderates. The second is that this surrounds on top of the glorification of motherhood, for example, the same way they glorify doctors, for example. These three reasons why this framing is important. The first, even if you agree each of the impact that OG says is important, this framing becomes analytically prior to their case. For women to feel empowered, for society to view women as much higher in value, People need to subscribe to the narrative as a whole, and it should be portrayed in a good way. The second reason why this outweighs that framing is the scale in which it's the scale on scale. Because if this debate agrees, in the context that it operates is that conservative or far right are the ones that treat women the worst, or like they're unlikely to buy into whatever the feminist movement say, then this proves why they are more inclined to buy what the feminist the movement portrays. This is going to be important under this debate. Because insofar as the conservative are the ones that are shut out from feminist movement, who are shutting out feminist movement, we feel directly why you get substantially more pieces of buy-in. The third is that this also directly deals with the responses from OO that OG was never immune to. Because if OO claims that the choice of feminism is and how it makes the movement stagnant, this contribution directly explains why you have more flexibility to revolve around the contribution that you have as a movement, because you are accepted on both political grounds. So you're not more appealing to conservative, when conservative can have their flexibility to engage with the narratives that the movement says. Now liberals can have a different approach to what the movement says. Wait for that, yeah, sure.
So let's also say that abortion is proper with feminist.
Yeah, this is also not comparative. If they'll say abortion under both sides also. So at worst, they'll shut you out, but they'll shut you out regardless, right? Between one and others one, we substantially increase the buy-in more. Lastly, then I want to deal with OO. OO talks to us about two things. The first is talking about the impact about having better mothers. I would claim that the narrative is quite hard to change mothers on the other side of the house. Because being better mothers might probably be about validation that they feel. But I'm unsure how they would feel being bad mothers insofar as what we claim is that mothers are bad because they're inexperienced. So what they need was material forms of aid. Here's how old CG comes to this debate. The first that the narrative of job translates down into better respect. We view motherhood as useful, so there's more incentive for you to improve mothers, being a mother overall, or there's more respect to society that gives to them on top of the glorification of motherhood. The second, even if you have welfare on both sides of the house that Dillon tries to wash this out, the unique benefit is that you have people and the choice to opt out. So even if people can pursue it, so some people uniquely under CG can pursue different types of jobs, can pursue different types of careers. The last thing I talk about is on OO's claim about how people talk out. Our extension directly deals with this when you explain why even in instances where they caught up after 5 p.m., the fathers are there to replace them. So when after the father has done their 5 p.m. jobs, the father can probably replace them. But also, I think that generally the ability it's like CG, if OO also claims that it means it, but also if OO claims that it is a duty, then they will not talk up under both sides of fathers. So again, does not compare. For all of these reasons, sorry, on CG.
Yeah. They have the table. Okay. What's not
It's choosing the redundant. You should something they will use.
right. Let's first use CG and then move on to how CO position themselves over the opening houses, right? Because CG has a few problems. I think CG's case firstly is a damn dystopian. They tell you that women cannot overcome the social and religious norms that exist within status quo, and therefore you ought not to oppose them. You ought to find catharsis and satisfaction within the job that you have put in as a mother, right? I think this is something that principally we ought to support. I think as a feminist movement, I think what Cheng Zu already told you, that you should principally still go against any norms that are
principally and like harmful, and that poses a harmful narrative towards women as a whole. Even if the fight is not one that's conducive, it's still one that is good for you to act upon. But I think the mechanisms that the CG gives you on how you are able to escape the furthest instance of harms by the opt-out mechanism still doesn't work, because they explain to you that if a woman doesn't want to be a mother, they can just opt out. But the mechanisms in which they explain to you, the opt-out mechanism doesn't take into account the only way that you want to opt out pre-birthing of that child is before you all decide to want to bear a child in the first place, is that you all need to understand the full length of the harms that comes from being a mother. And the only way that can exist is if you go through being a mother, right? The only way to find out a job is shit is to do the job. You hearing about how bad a job is doesn't give you the full extent of the experience or how this is necessarily going to be. That means there's unclear how much or how many mothers actually will effectively opt out in the first place. So you don't know the scale of benefits that this CG case actually bring. Right. Yes. That's the first thing, right? But I think what we tell you on CO is that I think CO's extension is uniquely positioned to getting the largest amount of benefits that the other houses wanting to get. Because we tell you that the concept of motherhood is not that is restrictive, that is wrong, not that is restrictive that all the other houses in today's debate argues, but whether that is wrong. And the only way for you to get the largest amount of benefit and welfare towards mothers and other individuals that exist within a familiar structure is for you to reject the whole concept of motherhood in the first place. I think what Cheng Zu explains to you is that how we remove the restrictions onto how you give benefits and welfare towards mother in order for you to then allow types of you also get the able to provide welfare to the types of atypical familial structures that Owen wants to talk about, right? We tell you how this does, like the rejection of motherhood means you get the types of protection for other what was the word here? Other individuals within your within this from a family. So that means it extends the benefits towards things like queer relationships and queer families that do not already adhere to the typical nuclear structure, right? The way in which you get the largest form of benefit is because now you are able to garner the support of both men and women who want to engage in a family, right? The problems with the opening house is that even if they tell you that you are able, that even if we buy the best case of OG, that you are able to get the and that you are able to demand recompensation by labeling it as a job, you don't necessarily get the types of top-down change because you only get the amount of support you can garner is quite limited because you don't actually get the types of support from the other side. But I think OG has other problems, right? I think OG's ways of getting recompensation is also kind of unclear. Because we argue that because because the way you label this as a job, you have the ability to set boundaries in order to get types of recompensation, right? Before I have been okay.
Before you get employed to a job, there are contracts to sign. If there are breaches to the contract, you can always go to the Ministry of Manpower. Why is it bad?
Because you don't actually sign the contract, there actually is no legal duty that you can now take speeches.
So what's the other people actually contribute? It's a duty, it's not contribution, it's not all when it's a job with responsibilities shared.
So like I'm just gonna ignore the fact. I think it tells you how the duty is semantics, right? But I dive into the analysis of why a father is more likely to engage in this, right? The problem of labeling as a job is that it restricts them into boxes, right? It tells you specifically that your job scope is this and your job scope do not overlap, and there's no incentive for people to want the father to want to engage in helping with the mother with these things in the first place, right? I think the opt-in that we get under the CO's extension is much larger. When you don't have this set boundaries, when you don't have this kind of narrative shift to to strengthen the existing patriarchal norm that the father is the breadwinner and that the implicit patriarchal structure that even exists within, even if you want to call a progressive family, still will worsen the issue, right? This means that the only way that you do get the father to actually help is when you reject all the concept of motherhood in the first place, where you tell that when you educate that this is a shared responsibility that doesn't have to have a gendered label in the first place, right? This means that you slowly shift the narrative to in order to like I think the best case that like what Umar's providing is that you still have the implication and you still have the kind of like the mental compass that there is a certain responsibility towards a gender, right? And that is something that we remove completely and we allow for that like shared responsibility to like what the environment. Okay. But yeah. So last thing on how we weigh overall. I think overall is correct that you ought to that the trying to encourage women into motherhood is one that's bad. But they go to the full extent to explain why the concept of motherhood is the existence of the motherhood under their side still restricts them to able to explore the benefits that OO tells you on how you're able to provide mothers more welfare and more choice, right? CO fills in that gap by telling you that the removal of this gendered concept means that women just get more support from all sides, that women within their choices of trying to be a mother, but also it empowers all other like individuals, regardless of their gender, to opt into familiar structures and also get the support. That yeah.